I'm curious, where in the world are you joining us from? Drop your city or country in the comments and make sure you're subscribed for all the latest updates. 50 years under one roof, erased in one sentence. The house smelled like Sunday dinner, garlic bread just out of the oven, tomato sauce bubbling on the stove. Margaret had always believed meals could hold families together. She'd believed that for 50 years. Apparently she was wrong. Paul sat at the head of the table, phone face down, lips pressed in a hard line. His wife Candace swirled her wine like she couldn't wait to be anywhere else. The silence was sharp enough to cut through steam rising off the pasta. Then Paul cleared his throat. "Mom, we need to talk." Margaret looked up, still wearing her apron. "Everything okay?" He didn't look at her. "It's time you found your own place." She blinked. "What?" Candace jumped in. "We've been discussing this for months. It's just not working anymore. We need space. Privacy." Margaret turned to Paul, eyes searching. "This is my home. Your father and I." Paul cut her off. "It was your home. Now it's ours. You've had your time, Mom." Duck outside, the wind rattled the kitchen window. Inside, something colder blew through Margaret's bones. She reached for the back of a chair, steadying herself. "I raised you in this house," she said softly. "I rocked you to sleep in the room you're now using as a guest office." Paul shrugged, avoiding her eyes. "That was a long time ago." Margaret glanced around the kitchen, every drawer labeled in her handwriting. The fridge covered in faded school photos. Her husband's worn toolbox still sat by the back door, where he'd left it the day before the heart attack took him. "I'm not asking to live forever," she whispered, "just to be treated like I still matter." Candace sighed dramatically. "We're not trying to hurt you. We just think you'd be more comfortable somewhere, quieter, cover the first month's rent. But this needs to happen soon." Margaret didn't cry, not in front of them. She wouldn't give them that. She nodded once, slowly, deliberately. "All right. You mean it?" Paul asked, surprised. "I said all right." She turned off the stove, without another word, ladled the sauce into a glass container, and placed it in the fridge. The kitchen felt foreign already, like it belonged to strangers. Then she climbed the stairs, not slowly, not defeated, but upright, bones heavy with dignity. Upstairs, she closed the door to her bedroom. Her fingers brushed the edge of her nightstand, the same one her husband had built when they were 22 and couldn't afford a real one. On the dresser sat an old photo, her Paul, as a toddler, her husband with his hand on her shoulder. Back when love wasn't questioned, when family was forever. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, 70 years old, widow, mother, housekeeper, memory keeper. Apparently now a burden. No, not a burden. Not anymore. They wanted her out. Then she'd go. But she would not go quietly. Decowding. Margaret silently decides to leave, but not broken. "They pushed me out. I walked out with dignity." She folded each blouse, deliberately, placed them beside her worn leather-bound journals, and carefully wrapped the ceramic photo frame of her and her husband, the one Paul never asked to keep. She left behind the fine china, the antique vanity, even the quilt her mother had made. Not out of defeat, out of detachment. She was done clinging to things in a house that had already erased her. Candace stood in the kitchen doorway, arms crossed. "You'll let us know where you end up, I assume." Margaret paused. "If it matters to you now, it should have mattered sooner." Candace opened her mouth, then shut it. Paul said nothing. Margaret's cab pulled up to the curb. The driver got out, helped load her things into the trunk. The neighbors watched from behind curtains. One even came out, Mrs. Elkins, from 2 doors down. "They're letting you leave," she whispered. "Again." "No one lets me do anything," Margaret replied. The cab door shut with finality. The hotel room was small. Beige walls, a single window facing a parking lot, and an artificial plant in the corner. The kind of place where time stood still. She unpacked only what she needed, a nightgown, a framed photo, and her husband's watch, still ticking. That night, she sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the ceiling. The quiet was different from home. It wasn't familiar. It wasn't warm. It wasn't haunted yet. Grief crept in like cold under the door. The home she'd once poured her life into now stood filled with other people's footsteps, Her garden, her kitchen, the walls she once painted by hand, now belonging to those who had cast her out. She could have fallen apart, but instead, she made tea and opened her journal. Day 1. I'm not where I was. I'm not where I'm going. But I know now, being discarded doesn't make me disposable. She underlined it twice. The next morning, someone slipped something under her hotel door, a flyer, bright, glossy, bold letters across the top. Open house. This Saturday, a classic home hits the market. She blinked. The photo on the front? Her house, her porch, her home, the open house, was in 3 days. Paul hadn't just kicked her out. He was selling it. A real estate flyer slips under her hotel door. Her house is listed for sale. They sold memories as if they were furniture, not by the strangers trampling through the life she'd built like it was a yard sale. The house looked brighter than she remembered, the porch light fixed, the windows washed, but it felt colder, sterile, stripped of the heartbeat she and her husband had poured into it. A red and white balloon bobbed from the mailbox. Open house today. 4-bed 2.5 bath. Great bones. Great bones. She thought bitterly, and not a single one of them yours, Paul. She slipped inside, behind a couple in matching windbreakers. The realtor greeted them with a plastic smile. Welcome. Gorgeous mid-century property, full remodel potential, perfect for buyers with vision. Margaret moved quietly through the entryway, keeping her head down. The living room looked nothing like it had. Her worn floral couch gone, her bookshelf empty. The family photos that once filled the wall, replaced with generic prints of wheat fields and abstract art. She stepped into the kitchen. Her kitchen, where she used to make cinnamon rolls every Christmas morning, where Paul once sat on the counter as a boy, helping stir pancake batter with more flour on his face than in the bowl. Now the stove was polished, the table gone, the walls painted over in modern gray. Strangers milled about, commenting as if her memories were merchandise. Nice light in here, said a woman with a clipboard. The backyard's small, her husband replied. It has potential, someone else added. Bit old though. Margaret's stomach turned. She gripped the edge of the counter to steady herself. Then she saw him, an older man standing alone near the back window, hands in his pockets. Silver hair, button-down shirt, tucked neatly. He looked at the garden. Her garden. Like he was seeing something no one else noticed. He turned and caught her watching. You knew the owners, he asked gently. I was one of them, she replied without thinking. He didn't laugh, didn't look surprised, just nodded. It shows, he said, glancing back at the garden. This place has soul. Forgot that her son was upstairs showing off the house to more strangers. Forgot that she was no longer allowed to call it hers. Do you garden? She asked. Used to, he said. Then I sold my place after my wife passed. Been looking for something that feels alive, not just square footage. Margaret smiled faintly. My husband planted those roses. Every spring like clockwork. He walked down the stairs, freezing when he saw her. His smile faltered. What are you doing here? The room went quiet. Guests pretended not to notice, but their glances were sharp. Margaret stood her ground. I came to see what you were selling. Paul stepped close. You don't belong here anymore. Richard watched him carefully. Margaret didn't flinch. Neither do you. Richard met her outside after she left the house in silence. Margaret stood at the end of the walkway, hands clasped, trying to ignore the heat rising in her chest. Not from the sun, but from Paul's vent. I didn't mean to make things awkward, Richard said softly, standing a respectful few steps away. She looked over, studying his expression. There was no pity in it, just something rarer, quiet understanding. You didn't, she replied. He did. Richard nodded once. I guessed as much. They started walking slowly, side by side, along the neighborhood sidewalk lined with rustling maples. The same ones Margaret and her husband planted before Paul could walk. She remembered tying ribbons to them when he graduated. I designed homes for 40 years, Richard said. And I've seen every kind of house there is. Big, cold, flashy. But this one, there's something different. It was built by love, Margaret murmured before she could stop herself. Richard looked at her. You're my husband's, she said. With his hands, After his shift at the plant, every night for 2 years, he never went to college, but he could read blueprints like a poet reads verse. Richard gave a low, thoughtful whistle. That explains the craftsmanship. I saw the exposed beam. He must have been meticulous. He was, she said quietly, and proud. We couldn't afford new furniture, but every nail in that house was driven with purpose. They walked a few more paces. Paul never understood that, she added, almost to herself. He only saw what was not what was earned. Richard slowed his step. If I buy it, I want you to know, I won't gut it. I won't paint over the heart. A house like that deserves to keep breathing the way it was built to. Margaret looked at him, surprised by the lump in her throat. You don't have to say that. I'm not saying it for you, he replied gently. I'm saying it for your husband. I'm not used to being seen anymore, she admitted. Maybe people forgot how to look. She chuckled softly. You're not like the others. I'm not sure if that's a compliment or a warning, he smiled. It's both. From the corner of her eye she saw Paul exit the house, phone to his ear, glancing around. He spotted them and froze. He walked briskly toward them. You're still here, he hissed. Margaret didn't rise. I was talking, to a buyer. His voice clung. Are you trying to sabotage the sale now? Richard stepped forward. I asked her to walk with me. If that's a problem, we can talk civilly. Paul ignored him, eyes locked on his mother. I thought you were out of our lives. What do you want, Mom? Sympathy? Attention? Margaret stared at him, voice low. All I ever wanted was respect. You made it clear I wasn't worth that anymore. Richard stepped between them slightly. You don't need to speak to her like that. Paul scoffed. This doesn't concern you. It concerns me, Richard said evenly. If I'm about to invest in a home whose history is treated like garbage. Paul blinked. Margaret rose slowly, meeting her son's eyes. Don't worry, I won't come back. Then she turned to Richard. I hope it finds the right hands. Margaret wasn't surprised when Paul showed up at her hotel the next morning, but the aggression in his knock still rattled her bones. 3 sharp raps, no pause, no courtesy. She opened the door half an inch, chain still latched. Can I help you? She asked. He pushed sunglasses up his forehead. You embarrassed me yesterday. Margaret gave a bitter half laugh. Did I? Or did your behavior finally introduce itself in public? Paul shifted his weight, glancing at the narrow hallway. You had no right to be at that open house. I had every right. That was my home for 5 decades. Paul's voice dropped. Was, past tense. You walked away. You pushed me out. Silence. Then stay away from Richard. He's a buyer, not your new best friend. Margaret met his eyes. He's a better son to my house than you ever were. Paul flinched. Just slightly. Then turned and left, muttering under his breath. Paul posted a smug photo online, standing in front of the sold sign, with keys in hand, arm around Candace. The caption read, New chapter, new upgrades coming. Goodbye, old ghosts. Margaret didn't comment. Didn't like it. Didn't even screenshot it. She just closed her phone, made tea, and sat by the hotel window staring into the gray autumn light. So it's yours now. It's ours, he said, and then hesitated. Well, mine, but it'll never be just mine. Would you come see it again properly? No strangers, no pressure. She hesitated. Part of her wanted to say no. She didn't want to cry again in those hallways, didn't want to feel what she had lost. But more than that, she wanted to see what had been saved. He pulled up at dusk. The porch light was on, not glaring, just warm. Inviting. Richard opened the door before she could knock. He looked slightly nervous, like a boy inviting someone to his treehouse for the first time. Welcome home, he said quietly. The smell hit her first. Not paint fumes or sawdust, but lemon wood polish, warm air and a faint trace of cinnamon from a candle flickering in the kitchen. Her feet moved slowly across the hardwood floor. It looked the same. The same grain her husband had stained himself. The same scuff marks near the hallway from Paul's tricycle. In the living room, something caught her eye. Photos. Hers. On the mantle. Restored. Wedding day. Baby Paul. Their first Christmas. Her husband in the garden with dirt on his knees and laughter in his eyes. She turned, stunned. You kept them. I found a box in the attic. Richard said. Candace must have left them behind. Or discarded them, Margaret thought. He stepped aside, gesturing down the hall. There's more. She followed. The door to the workshop was open, exactly how her husband left it. Tools hung neatly on the pegboard. The red vise still clamped to the workbench. His flannel jacket faded, threadbare, still hanging on the hook. Margaret reached for it with trembling fingers. Thank you, she whispered. Richard shook his head. It wasn't charity, it was reverence. He poured her tea, it was reverence. They returned to the living room. He poured her tea, sat beside her, a respectful distance. No rush, no demands, just presence. I was married for 41 years, he said. When she passed, I sold everything and moved into a high-rise. It had no soul, just convenience. Margaret looked around. This house has bones. He smiled. It also has a heartbeat again. She didn't reply, but her eyes shimmered with tears she didn't hide. They called it outdated. The town called it home. Gepord. Margaret hadn't worn pearls in years. Not since her husband's funeral. But tonight, as she stood in front of the mirror in the upstairs bedroom, she once called her own, she clasped them around her neck. Her hands trembled, not from age, but from something deeper, purpose. Downstairs, the house was alive again. Warm yellow lights glowed from the windows, tables lined with pastries, and punch stretched along the dining room wall. Bouquets from neighborhood gardens rested in mason jars. Laughter spilled from the front porch, where folding chairs creaked under old friendships. This was no estate sale. This was resurrection. Richard met her at the top of the staircase. He offered his arm. You ready? I lived through 50 Christmases in this house, she said. This one might be the most surreal. He chuckled. You look like you belong here. She gave him a soft smile. I always did. Outside, guests gathered under strings of warm cafe lights. The fundraiser was for a local seniors housing initiative. Richard's idea, but Margaret's cause. Word had spread quickly, the architect and the widow opening their home for a night of storytelling and support. Margaret stood near the garden with a microphone in hand. Her voice was quiet at first, but steady. My husband laid every brick of this house. He did it for us, for family, for our future. He believed homes should be earned, not flipped like poker chips. People nodded. She continued. We raised a son here, planted trees out back, bled in the kitchen and danced in the hallway. And when I was told I didn't belong anymore, this house reminded me I always did. Applause, not polite, not pitying. Margaret spotted them stepping through the gate like ghosts at a wedding they weren't invited to. Candace wore tight lips and too much perfume. Paul looked out of place, as if someone had dropped him in a museum of a life he'd erased. They froze when they saw her at the center of it all. Margaret didn't flinch. Later in the dining room, guests admired the restored photos and tool bench. That's her husband's workshop, one whispered. She designed that garden from seed, another added. Candace leaned into Paul. Why is everyone acting like she still lives here? Paul didn't answer. Margaret found herself cornered by a group of longtime neighbors. Tell the story about the magnolia tree again, someone said. She smiled. We planted it after Paul was born. My husband wanted something that would grow with him. It never bloomed the first 3 years, but he kept saying, patience, Maggie. Things bloom when they're ready. People sighed. Someone wiped away a tear. Behind them, Paul stared. Candace whispered, she's stealing the Margaret turned, met her son's gaze across the room. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. She simply held her ground. The woman whose home was sold, but found it again. Margaret blinked. I suppose I am. We'd love to interview you. Your story, this house. It means something. Margaret looked toward Richard, who gave a small nod. She turned back to the reporter. I'll think about it. The TV crew approaches Margaret for an interview. They erased me privately. I returned publicly. The morning of the interview, Margaret stood in the hallway mirror, smoothing the same navy blue blouse she wore to her husband's retirement party decades ago. She didn't wear it to impress. She wore it because it reminded her who she was before the world decided she was too old to matter. The TV crew arrived promptly at 10. A young journalist named Erin, bright-eyed and polite, stepped inside with a small team and a camera rig. The house was already sunlit. Every window open, breeze wafting softly through lace curtains. We'll shoot by the fireplace if that's okay, Erin asked. Margaret nodded, gesturing toward the mantel lined with restored photos. She sat in the armchair, her old chair, brought back from storage by Richard, reupholstered but familiar. He stood just out of frame, watching. The camera blinked red. We're live in 5. Margaret exhaled. Not nerves. Resolve. Upamiran smiled as the countdown ended. Today we're with Margaret Delaney, a widow, mother and quiet hero, whose story touched thousands after her recent community fundraiser. Margaret blinked slowly, offering a gentle smile. Erin leaned forward. Margaret, can you tell us what this house means to you? Margaret looked directly into the camera. This isn't just a house, she said. It's where I learned how to be a wife, a mother. It's where I held my husband's hand as he passed, where I packed school lunches and buried pets and planted trees. It's where life happened. Erin nodded, moved. You were asked to leave this home recently. What was that like? Margaret didn't blink. I wasn't asked. I was dismissed. My own son told me I was a burden, but I didn't let that define me. She paused. Sometimes, losing everything shows you what can't be taken. Across town, in a crowded bar where flat-screen TVs lined the walls, Paul sat nursing a whiskey. The volume wasn't up, but the closed captions scrolled across the screen. His mother's name, his mother's face, her story, her dignity. The bartender glanced over. That your mom? Paul looked away. Used to be. But Richard, he preserved everything, not because I asked him to, because he respected what was here before him. That's what makes a place sacred. Respect. Richard, standing just off camera, looked away briefly, as if the words were too heavy to hold in his chest. The segment wrapped with a final question. What do you want people to take away from your story? Margaret straightened. Her voice didn't tremble. You are not disposable. No matter how old you get, no matter how loudly the world tells you you've expired, your memories matter, and if they cast you out, find the strength to come home, even if it's by the front door of your past. Margaret reached for her cane, rising with care. I should be thanking you for letting an old woman's silence speak. Upamimu, the clip aired on the local network. By midnight, it had gone viral. Heart of the House trended regionally. Neighbors reposted. Strangers commented. Messages flooded in from other seniors, forgotten mothers, discarded grandfathers, and adult children watching in silent shame. Upamimu, reporters dub Margaret, the heart of the house. Public truth burns private lies. A knock at her hotel room door came fast, sharp, angry. Margaret had just set down a thank you note she'd been writing to the reporter when the pounding started. She knew who it was before she opened it. Paul. His face was red with embarrassment, not effort. He stepped in without waiting. You had no right. Margaret shut the door quietly behind him. No right to what? Paul? To speak, to tell the truth. You ambushed me. You ambushed us. You knew that story would go viral. Now everyone thinks I threw my own mother onto the street. She tilted her head. You did. He paced the cramped hotel room like a caged man, his button-down shirt wrinkled and clinging to sweat. You could have talked to me before going on TV. You blindsided me. Margaret sat down calmly. Like you did, over dinner, telling me to find my own place? That's different. How? He didn't answer. Abetting, she sighed, folding her hands in her lap. You're embarrassed. That's why you're here. Not because you're sorry, not because you care. You think this doesn't affect me? Oh, I know it does. You spent your life caring what others think, while I spent mine caring what matters. It turned, voice low now, almost desperate. You don't understand what it's like, being the only child, feeling responsible. Margaret stood. I buried your father alone, raised you alone, paid for your braces, your college, your down payment. Don't talk to me about responsibility. Paul's mouth opened. Nothing came out. A knock interrupted them. Richard. Everything okay? He asked. Margaret nodded but didn't look at Paul. He was just leaving. Richard's eyes didn't move from Paul's face. Good. Paul hesitated, jaw clenched. Stay away from my family. Richard blinked. She is your family. Paul said nothing, as he walked out, door clicking behind him. Later that evening, As the sun dipped behind the horizon, Richard brought Margaret a glass of ginger tea. They sat on the hotel balcony in silence for a few minutes before he finally spoke. "You okay?" "I'm used to being ignored," she said. "I'm not used to being hated for surviving it." Richard placed his hand gently over hers. "What they did says everything about them. What you did, how you carried yourself, says everything about you." She exhaled deeply. The next morning, a surprise arrived at the front desk. A bouquet crisp white roses with a card. Margaret assumed, for a moment, it might be from Paul. But the card read, "To the woman who reminded us what home really means." Channel 8 News Team. The support didn't stop there. At the grocery store, strangers recognized her and smiled. At church, the pastor quoted her line about legacy and memory. Even the local paper featured her on the front page. From forgotten to fierce, Widow's Stand inspires thousands. Margaret sat frozen in the hotel room chair, rereading the letter that arrived by courier that morning. "Dear Mrs. Delaney, we'd be honored to feature your story on our national morning show, Sunrise Across America. You've inspired millions. We believe your voice deserves a national stage." Below, neatly printed details: travel, hotel, wardrobe assistance. All arranged. All confirmed. She stared at her name, bold in ink. For most of her life, Margaret Delaney was a name on the back of PTA flyers, on casseroles dropped at funerals, on handwritten checks for her son's dreams. Now, her name would be on the screen. "I've spent a lifetime being small so others could feel big. That ends now." The flight was short, but the change felt massive. A car met her at the airport. A young woman in a headset led her through the studio, adjusting Margaret's collar, powdering her cheeks, brushing wisps of gray hair from her face. "You look beautiful," the assistant whispered. "I look like myself," Margaret corrected with a wink. Across from her sat the host, polished, practiced, curious. Cameras rolled. Joining us today is Margaret Delaney, whose story captured hearts across the country after her appearance on a local station. "Margaret, welcome." She smiled, poised. "Thank you for having me." The questions started simply, about the house, the fundraiser, her return. But then the host asked, "What message do you think your story sends to people watching?" Margaret looked directly into the lens. "That it's never too late to reclaim your voice. That being discarded doesn't mean you disappear. I was pushed out of my home, but I found something stronger than bricks, self-worth." She paused. "And that no one should feel like they have an expiration date on love, respect, or hope." The audience behind the cameras clapped softly. Some were visibly emotional. Backstage, Richard waited, pride plain in his eyes. "I think you just woke up a country," he said, as they walked out into the sun-drenched city street. Margaret didn't reply right away. She simply looked up at the sky. "For once," she said, "it feels like the world sees me." Aka. The episode aired that afternoon. Phone calls flooded the network. Social media lit up. "She reminds me of my grandmother. We need more stories like this. I called my mom today." "Thank you, Margaret. She's the kind of woman who raised this country quietly." Aka. Across town, Paul sat slouched on the couch, the TV remote limp in his hand. He hadn't known she'd be on. Candace stood nearby, arms crossed. "She's milking this for everything," she muttered. But Paul didn't answer. He just stared at the screen, his mother framed in soft light, speaking with quiet authority. And for the first time, he didn't see her as old. He saw her as larger than him. A housing nonprofit offers to partner with her story.